The boy had no name anyone in the little town cared to remember. In truth, he had once been given one, back when he was very small. Back when his mother's voice still called to him at night and a pair of warm hands pulled him into the safety of a blanket, but that was another life, one buried under layers of hunger, wind, and loneliness. Now, if anyone bothered to speak to him at all, they called him kid, or boy, or hey, you, and sometimes, when the meaner ones passed by names that carried the sting of contempt, whatever his real name had been, the winter winds had long since blown it away. For as long as he could recall, he had belonged to no one and nothing. The town's wooden boardwalks were his streets. The alleys between sagging buildings were his hallways. He had never had a bed. Only the hard-packed dirt behind the livery or the warped floorboards of an abandoned shack on the far edge of town. He survived on crusts of bread scavenged from behind the saloon, bruised apples dropped from freight wagons, and whatever kindness a rare soul might spare. In summer, he could curl up against a warm wall and let the sun keep the cold at bay. But now, in the heart of winter, every night was a battle he wasn't sure he'd win. His most prized possession was a blanket not much more than a ragged sheet of wool, worn thin in places and fraying at the edges. But to him, it was treasure. He'd found it years ago, half buried in a heap of rubbish outside the undertaker's shop, smelling faintly of cedar and something older, something that spoke of another life. The blanket was faded to the color of ash, with one corner stitched clumsily as if someone had once tried to mend it. It wasn't pretty, but it was his, and it was the only thing between his skin and the long bone-deep cold that settled in. After sundown, he carried it everywhere, rolled under his arm or draped over his shoulders like a threadbare cloak. Without it, he was naked to the wind. That night, the cold was unlike anything he had ever felt before. It wasn't simply in the air, it was in his bones, gnawing through his thin coat, crawling beneath his skin. The wind that came off the prairie was a living thing, sharp as a knife, howling down the empty streets with a voice that seemed to carry the memory of wolves. The moon hung pale and distant, casting the snow in a dim silver glow. The town was silent but for the creak of signs swinging on rusty chains and the occasional groan of ice shifting in the river beyond. The boy kept his head low, his bare hands tucked under his arms, each breath turning to mist that clung briefly before being torn away. He had been searching for a place to curl up, some corner shielded from the wind. The old freight office might work, its porch sagged enough to block the worst of the gusts, and he'd hidden there before, but as he made his way down the street, his ears caught something strange. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the creak of timber. It was softer, higher-pitched, and broken into tiny bursts. A cry. At first, he thought it might be a stray cat or a coyote pup, lost and hungry. But as he turned toward the sound, threading between the black shapes of snow-covered barrels and crates, he realized it was different, more human, though thin and weak. The cry came again, from somewhere deeper in the shadows. He stopped, listening hard, his breath catching in the stillness between gusts. There it was again, barely louder than the whisper of the wind. His feet carried him toward it, almost without thought. The sound led him past the shuttered windows of the general store, past the frozen trough by the livery, and into the alley where the snow lay untouched. The moonlight only just reached the ground here, turning the shadows into a pool of ink. The wind seemed to die as he stepped further in, the muffled cry drawing him closer until it led him to an abandoned wagon. It leaned against the wall of the old mercantile, its wheels half buried in snow, the canvas cover torn and flapping in the wind like a tired flag. He ducked under the edge, his breath clouding in the cold space beneath, and froze. There, lying on a patch of burlap sacks, was the smallest child he had ever seen, a baby, wrapped in nothing but a thin scrap of cloth. Her skin was bluish in the moonlight, her tiny fists curled and trembling. The crying he'd heard was now just a soft whimper, as if she no longer had the strength to cry loud. Snowflakes clung to her lashes. For a moment, he simply stared. His mind couldn't quite make sense of it. Who would leave a baby out here in the freezing dark? Was someone coming back for her? He looked around the alley, expecting to see a door swing open or a shadow step forward, but there was nothing, just the silent, empty town and the restless flap of the wagon's torn cover. The boy's fingers clenched around his blanket. The cold gnawed at him, whispering that if he stayed much longer, he'd be no use to anyone. Yet the sight of the baby lying there, so small and helpless, tightened something in his chest. He crouched down, his knees sinking into the snow, and reached out. The baby's skin was icy to the touch, and she flinched weakly at his fingers. He didn't think about the fact that this blanket was all he had in the world, or that without it, he might not survive the night. He didn't think about the risk of being found holding a native child in a town where tensions ran high. He simply knelt there, heart thudding, and began to wrap her in the only thing that had ever kept him safe. The night was colder than usual for early autumn, a biting chill that seeped into every gap and shadow of the sleeping frontier town. The streets, narrow and crooked, lay silent under a pale, watchful moon, its silver light spilling across uneven wooden sidewalks and the rutted dirt road that served as the main thoroughfare. A few lanterns still glowed dimly in windows, but most buildings were dark, their occupants wrapped in warmth and dreams. The scent of wood smoke hung in the air, mingling with the faint temps of pine from the surrounding forest, and somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote called out a plaintive, haunting cry that carried across the sleeping land. In an alley near the edge of town, between a boarded-up feed store and a leaning stable that smelled faintly of hay and manure, the boy huddled in a nest of burlap sacks and discarded crates, his thin frame trembling beneath the single threadbare blanket he owned. He was no stranger to cold. In fact, the boy had learned to measure nights not by the hours but by how deep the frost sank into his bones. On warmer evenings, he might drift in and out of dreams about the life he once had, vague memories of a mother's gentle humming, a father's laugh that rumbled like a far-off storm. But on nights like this, when the wind knifed through every seam in his shelter and his toes went numb, there was no room for dreams. There was only survival. He curled tighter, pressing his knees to his chest, drawing the blanket around him as though he could trap what little warmth remained in his frail body. The cloth, once blue, was now a mottled gray from years of dirt and wear, its edges fraying, holes spreading like a slow disease. Still, it was his one possession, his one shield against the world. That was when he heard it, the faintest sound, so soft at first he thought it might be the wind, but the wind didn't whimper, it didn't shiver in the dark. Slowly, cautiously, the boy lifted his head, his breath fogged in the air, and he strained his ears, trying to place the noise. It came again, a thin, reedy cry that rose and fell like the mewling of a kitten. But it wasn't a kitten. He knew animal sounds well. Hunger and necessity had taught him that skill. This was different, human, small, and desperate. The boy eased out from under his blanket, setting it carefully aside, and crept toward the mouth of the alley. The moonlight painted the street in shades of silver and shadow, and there, near the edge of the woods, he saw movement, a shape, a bundle. He hesitated. Trouble often came in strange shapes, and he had learned to be wary of anything that appeared abandoned. But the sound drew him forward, step by cautious step, until he stood over the bundle. His breath caught. In his throat, wrapped in rough cloth, its tiny face half hidden, was a baby, its skin dusky, its hair black as the midnight sky. The child's cheeks were flushed from the cold, lips trembling as it let out another feeble cry. Around them, the world seemed to hold its breath. The boy glanced left and right, but the street was empty. No mother, no one at all. Only the sound of the wind through the pines and the soft crackle of frost settling on leaves. A dozen questions hammered through his mind. Who had left this baby here? Why? Was it lost? Was it bait for some cruel trick? He thought of the stories he'd heard in the saloon tales of feuds between settlers and the native tribes that roamed these lands. He'd heard men speak of raids, of stolen cattle, of vengeance and blood, and yet here lay this child, defenseless, shivering in the cold. The boy crouched, his knees creaking from the cold, and reached out a tentative hand. The baby's skin was icy to the touch. He knew that feeling, well, the creeping numbness that meant the cold was winning. Without thinking, he scooped the child up, cradling it awkwardly against his chest. The baby gave a soft sigh, its tiny fingers clutching at the front of his ragged shirt as though it recognized the faint heat of another living body. For a moment, the boy just stood there, holding the child, his mind a whirl of uncertainty. He had nothing, no food, no fire, no home, worth the name. Yet the idea of setting the baby down, of walking away, made his stomach twist. He looked toward the woods, their dark shapes looming like silent sentinels, and then back toward the sleeping town. If he took the baby to the sheriff, what then? He had seen the sheriff turn away hungry men before. He had no faith that the law would treat a native child with kindness. He bit his lip, feeling the rough chapping from wind and cold, and made his decision. He would keep the baby warm, at least until morning, at least until he figured out what to do next. He returned to the alley, clutching the child close, and settled down into his corner. The blanket, his one blanket, lay where he had left it, and he pulled it around them both. It was not much. The cold still seeped in through the fabric, biting at his skin, but it was better than nothing. The baby nestled closer, its cries fading to soft breaths. In the dim light, the boy studied its tiny features, the curve of its nose, the faint flutter of its eyelids. He wondered if someone was out there searching for it right now, frantic with fear. He wondered if someone had given it up willingly, or if some tragedy had ripped it from its family. The hours crawled by, each one marked by the ache in his limbs and the slow rhythm of the baby's breathing. He tried to sleep, but his mind refused rest. He thought about how life had brought him here, to this frozen alley with nothing but a worn blanket and a stranger's child in his arms. He thought about the things he'd lost: parents, home, the simple certainty of belonging somewhere. And yet, holding the baby, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. It was fragile, like a spark in the dark, but it warmed him in a way the blanket never could. He didn't know what morning would bring, but for now, in this small, cold corner of the world, he knew what he had to do. The boy had never held something so fragile in his life. The baby's skin was pale beneath the dirt, lips tinged with blue, eyes fluttering open only briefly before sinking shut again. His tiny breaths were shallow and uneven, like a candle's flames struggling against the wind. The boy, no more than 12, perhaps younger, could feel the small chest rise and fall against his own. The heartbeat faint but still there. That heartbeat, so fragile yet stubborn, stirred something deep in him, a feeling he couldn't name but knew was too strong to ignore. He had lived on the edge of the town for as long as he could remember, surviving on scraps, discarded bread, crusts, and whatever charity a rare kind soul might throw his way. No one had ever depended on him before, but now, cradling that shivering bundle, he felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his narrow shoulders. Snowflakes caught in the boy's hair, melting almost as soon as they touched his skin, but the cold still bit into his bones. His fingers were already numb, yet he tightened them around the baby, afraid that letting go even for a moment would be a kind of betrayal. His blanket, the only thing keeping him from freezing each night, was wrapped snugly around the child. Now, the boy's own skin prickled and stiffened from the wind that sliced through his thin shirt, but he ignored it. It didn't matter. If he had learned anything from the streets, it was that his own discomfort was nothing compared to what this child might lose if he didn't act. He scanned the darkened alley for any sign of movement. The town was quiet at this hour, just the soft groan of wooden beams in the wind, the far-off barking of a restless dog, and the faint hum of wind whipping around the buildings. Somewhere, a door creaked, then slammed shut. The boy knew the rules. No one would take him in. Not for the night, not for the warmth. And no one, absolutely no one, would take in a native baby. Tensions between the settlers and the local tribe had been running high for months. Just the sight of the child in his arms could be enough to make some people call the sheriff, or worse. But the boy had no patience for politics or grudges between men he'd never met. All he saw was a life hanging in the balance. And so, despite his aching feet and the gnawing cold in his chest, he started moving. He didn't even know where he was going, only that standing still meant death for the tiny creature in his arms. He thought of the barn he sometimes slept in, an abandoned structure at the far end of town, but it had no doors to block out the wind. He needed somewhere sheltered, someplace the cold couldn't reach them. The moonlight painted the snow a pale silver as he crossed the narrow streets, ducking into shadows whenever a lantern glowed in a window. His breath came out in uneven clouds, and the baby made soft whimpering sounds against his chest. The boy murmured nonsense under his breath, words he didn't even think about, gentle, quiet sounds meant to reassure the baby, and maybe himself. "It's okay, you're fine, just a little more. We'll find a place." Finally, he remembered an old shack beyond the creek, half collapsed but still standing. He had never slept there before. It was farther from the safety of town, closer to the wild edges where the forest began. But it would at least break the wind, and tonight that was enough. His boots crunched over the snow as he made his way, each step heavier than the last. The baby's weight was slight, yet in his exhaustion it felt as if he were carrying a great burden, something far heavier than flesh and bone, a promise. When he reached the shack, the roof sagged low under the weight of snow, and the door hung from one hinge. The boy nudged it open with his foot, wincing at the screech of rusted metal. Inside, it smelled of old wood and damp earth. There was no furniture, just the remnants of a rotting crate in the corner, but it was enough. He set the baby gently on the crate, brushing away the splinters with his sleeve before wrapping the blanket tighter. Then he crouched low, pressing his hands to his mouth and blowing warm air toward the tiny face. Again and again, ignoring the way his own lips were going numb. In the dim moonlight that filtered through the gaps in the roof, he could see the child's eyelashes tremble. A small hand twitched beneath the folds of the blanket. Relief washed through him, not much, but enough to keep going. He pulled the blanket's edges over his own back too, curling around the baby like a shield. Every time the wind howled through the cracks, he pressed closer, determined to keep that fragile warmth from escaping. He thought of the days ahead, not in detail, but in a vague, daunting way. What would he do tomorrow? He had no food to give the baby, no milk, no medicine. He could barely feed himself. But for tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight was about surviving until morning. He had done that before. He could do it again for both of them. The night stretched on, measured in the baby's shallow breaths and the boy's silent prayers to no one in particular. He didn't know if the child had a family searching for him, or if some terrible fate had left him abandoned. All he knew was that somewhere between finding the baby and curling up in that shack, he had decided he wouldn't let go. Not now, not ever. And so, in that frozen, forgotten corner of the world, a homeless boy who had never been needed before became the only line between a fragile life and the cold darkness pressing in. He didn't know it yet, but that choice, the simple act of wrapping a baby in his only blanket, would set events in motion that neither he nor the town could have imagined. The first hint that something was different came before the sun even crested the distant ridge. The boy had spent the night huddled in the corner of an abandoned shed at the edge of town, the same place he sometimes used when the wind grew too sharp to sleep under the open sky. The blanket was gone, of course still wrapped around the tiny native baby he had found the night before, but the image of her small, warm weight in his arms had burned itself into his mind. Even in dreams, he had felt her breath against his skin, each exhale a fragile proof that she was alive. He had not expected thanks. People didn't thank boys like him. In the years since his parents' deaths, the town had treated him as little more than a shadow, sometimes pitied, more often ignored, and occasionally scorned. The baker might shoo him away from the back door. The blacksmith might toss him a burnt crust of bread if he was in a generous mood. But warmth, real warmth, had become a stranger to him long ago. That was why the blanket had been so precious. It wasn't just wool, it was the single barrier between his thin body and the winter nights that crept into his bones. Giving it away had been the kind of choice you made without thinking. The kind your heart decided before your mind could protest. The town was still asleep when he first noticed the sound. It wasn't the usual morning noises, no rooster crow, no clatter of a milk cart's wheels. This was a low rhythmic rumble, like distant thunder. His eyes opened fully, and for a moment, he thought he was imagining it. But as it grew louder, he realized it was the tread of many feet. Horses too, he thought, but moving slowly, as if approaching with care. He rose, his bare toes curling against the cold wooden floor, and slipped out through the shed's crooked door. The sky was pale, gray, that in-between hour when night is not gone but day is already stretching its fingers toward the land. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and frost, and there just beyond the frost-rimmed fence line, he saw them. A line of riders, their silhouettes dark against the lifting mist. Their horses stood steady, steam curling from their nostrils in the cold. Feathers caught the weak light, tied into the riders' hair or fastened to their spears. Each man sat tall and silent, his gaze fixed on the boy. There must have been 100 of them. His first instinct was to run, not because they frightened him, but because he didn't understand why they were there. He was nobody. He had nothing worth taking. But as he stood frozen in the damp grass, something in their stillness stopped him. They were not here to harm. This was not the restless, aggressive watch of men ready for violence. It was protective. Then movement drew his eyes. To the center of the line, a man rode forward, slow and deliberate. He was older, his hair streaked with gray, but there was no weakness in the way he held himself. He wore a buffalo hide cloak, and his eyes, dark, steady, never left the boy's face. When he stopped just a few paces away, the boy could see the small bundle he carried, the blanket, his blanket, and inside it, the baby. She was awake now, her tiny hands clutching the wool, her gaze wandering but calm. The man dismounted, every motion deliberate, and walked toward the boy. In the hush of the dawn, the boy could hear the leather creak and the soft crunch of frost under the man's boots. When he stopped before him, he lowered the bundle, letting the boy see the baby more clearly. "She lives," the man said, his voice low but resonant. His English carried an accent, the vowels rounder, the consonants softer, but each word landed with weight. "Because of you." The boy's throat tightened. He wanted to say it was nothing, that anyone would have done the same. But the truth sat heavy in him. He knew not everyone would have. Many in town would have turned away, too wary or too cold to help. The man looked at him for a long time, as if reading the thoughts he couldn't speak. Then he straightened, his gaze sweeping toward the riders behind him. At a signal only they seemed to understand. The line of warriors dismounted in near-perfect unison. The ground seemed to hum beneath the boy's feet as they stepped forward, forming a half-circle around him. One by one, they bowed their heads. It was not a shallow nod, not the quick dip of politeness. They bowed deeply, in a gesture that seemed to carry centuries of meaning, honor, respect, perhaps even gratitude. The boy felt his breath catch. No one had ever bowed to him. No one had ever looked at him as if he mattered. The leader spoke, again, his voice carrying so that every man could hear. "From this day, you are not alone. This child is ours. And now, so are you. If ever you are in need, call, and we will come." The boy could not find words. His hands were trembling not from the cold, but from the sheer force of what was happening. 100 warriors, standing guard in the dawn for a homeless boy, because he had given away the only thing he owned to save a life. Somewhere deep in his chest, a warmth bloomed. It was not the kind a blanket could give. It was the kind that came from knowing you had been seen, truly seen, and found worthy. And as the first rays of the sun spilled over the ridge, gilding the warriors' feathers and spears in gold, he understood that the morning had brought him something greater than shelter, greater than food. It had brought him a family. The moment the leader's words settled into the air, the boy felt the weight of them sink deep, like seeds planted in soil he hadn't known was there. "You are not alone." They were simple words, but for someone who had lived half his life without the warmth of belonging, they were more powerful than anything he'd ever been told. For a long moment, no one moved. The warriors remained in that half-circle, their heads bowed, the mist from their breath rising like faint smoke into the pale morning air. The only sound was the slow shifting of the horses behind them, the occasional soft clink of tack. The boy's mind raced, his pulse quick in his ears. Then, without another word, The leader reached into the folds of his buffalo hide cloak and drew out a small pouch made of soft, tanned leather. He pressed it into the boy's hand. The pouch was surprisingly heavy, and the leather felt warm from the man's body heat. The boy glanced down at it, uncertain whether he was supposed to open it now or later. But when his gaze lifted again, the leader had already turned to the baby still swaddled in the blanket the boy had given away. With a tenderness that surprised him, the man adjusted the wool around her tiny face, making sure no frost could reach her skin. Then the leader looked over his shoulder and spoke in a language the boy did not know. The syllables were smooth and rhythmic, like the flow of water over stone. Instantly, the other warriors stepped back, leaving a clear path between the boy and a chestnut mare tethered nearby. The horse was beautiful, her coat, sleek, even in the dim light, her dark eyes, bright and steady. The boy had seen horses before, of course. In town, they were tools for pulling wagons or plowing fields, often treated more like machinery than living things. But this mare was different. There was intelligence in her gaze, a kind of quiet dignity. The leader gestured to her. "She will carry you." The boy's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Carry him? Where, and why? Yet the mare stood there patiently, as if waiting for him to accept. It had been years since he'd touched a horse, and never one that looked like this. Still, something in the leader's tone told him this was not a suggestion. The warriors moved with practiced efficiency. One lifted the boy easily, as if he weighed no more than a sack of grain, and set him gently into the mare's saddle. Her body was warm beneath him, and he felt a faint shiver run through her muscles as she adjusted to his weight. The leader mounted his own horse and took the baby in one arm, the other hand holding the reins. Without any signal the boy could see, the warriors began to move. The mare followed them naturally, her gait smooth, the world passing by in a slow rhythm of hoofbeats. They left the town behind quickly, the dirt road winding upward into low hills covered in frost-bitten grass. The boy glanced back once, watching the cluster of buildings shrink into the distance, and wondered if anyone had noticed him go. Probably not. He had slipped in and out of that town for years without anyone caring. As they climbed higher, the land began to change. The air grew sharper, cleaner, carrying the scent of pine. The frost sparkled on the grass like shards of glass scattered by some unseen hand. Ravens wheeled above, their dark wings catching the pale light. The warriors rode in silence, their presence so steady that it began to feel almost like the earth itself was carrying him. After some time, minutes, maybe hours, the boy realized the leader was speaking to him again. "We take you to our winter camp," he said. "You gave what you could to one of ours. We will give what we can to you." The boy swallowed. But why? The word felt clumsy on his tongue. The leader's eyes softened, but his voice held firm. "In our way, a life saved creates a bond. You wrapped your blanket around a child who was not your own. You carried her through the cold. You gave what little you had, not knowing who might see or what might follow. That is a gift greater than gold." The boy didn't know what to say. In his world, kindness had always been something you gave only if you could afford. It had most people acted like they couldn't. But here, these men were telling him that the small, desperate act he'd made without thinking was worth this. The hills opened into a narrow valley, the ground dappled with the shadows of tall evergreens. Ahead, faint smoke rose between the trees. As they drew closer, the boy could see shapes moving: women, children, elders, all busy with the quiet work of the morning. The warriors' arrival drew no alarm. Instead, people lifted their heads, eyes following the boy with quiet curiosity. The leader dismounted first, then helped the boy down. The mare stepped back, as if her job was done. The pouch was still in the boy's hand, warm against his palm. The leader nodded toward it. "Open it." With cold, stiff fingers, the boy untied the leather thong and tipped the contents into his hand. Something small and hard slid out: a carved figure of a bird, no bigger than his thumb, made from polished bone. Its wings were outstretched, every feather etched in careful detail. The boy stared at it, unsure what it meant. The leader's voice was quiet but certain. "The hawk sees far and does not forget. Keep it with you. It is a promise." The boy closed his fingers around the carving. He didn't understand the full meaning, but he felt the weight of it, less in its actual mass, more in the way it seemed to root him to this moment, to these people. And for the first time in years, he felt something he had almost forgotten how to feel: safe. The boy followed the leader through the narrow opening in the trees, the chestnut mare walking behind them as if she, too, belonged here. The winter camp lay nestled in a sheltered hollow, where the wind broke against the ridge and the sun could touch the snow without driving it to blind whiteness. Smoke rose from several low, rounded lodges, their frames covered in hides, stitched tight to keep the warmth inside. Between them, narrow paths wound through the snow, already tamped flat by many feet. He saw women bent over baskets, their hands busy weaving reeds into tight spirals. Children darted between the lodges, their laughter bright against the muffled quiet of the snow. A group of older men sat near a fire, their faces lined and weathered, speaking in low tones as they carved shapes into long strips of wood. The boy felt eyes on him from every direction. No one looked at him with suspicion exactly, but neither did they greet him with easy smiles. He supposed that made sense. He was a stranger here, a piece of another world that had slipped into theirs. Still, there was no hostility, only the kind of measured watchfulness that comes from people who have learned to read intentions before they trust them. The leader guided him toward the largest lodge in the center of the camp. It was taller than the others, its doorway flanked by 2 poles carved with patterns the boy did not recognize. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the scent of wood smoke. The flicker of firelight painted the walls in shifting shadows. A woman rose to greet them. Her hair was long and streaked with silver, and her eyes were sharp but kind. She carried the baby the boy had given his blanket to earlier. The sight of her alive, pink-cheeked now instead of pale and still, made something unclench in his chest. The leader spoke to the woman in their language, and she nodded, listening without interrupting. Then she turned to the boy and spoke in slow, careful English. "You will stay here tonight. We will give you food, and you will rest." The boy opened his mouth to say thank you, but before the words could come, his stomach betrayed him with a loud growl. The woman's lips twitched in a faint smile. "Yes," she said. As if answering him, without him having spoken, she led him to a place near the fire, where a woven mat had been laid out. A shallow wooden bowl was set before him, filled with something steaming. It was a thick stew, heavy with chunks of root vegetables and bits of meat that fell apart at the touch of the spoon. The first mouthful nearly burned his tongue, but the warmth that spread through him was worth it. He hadn't eaten anything like this in Mahi. He couldn't even remember. The leader sat across from him, speaking quietly with the silver-haired woman. Every now and then, the boy caught a glance in his direction, but there was no judgment in their eyes, only thoughtfulness. When the bowl was empty, the woman handed him a cup of hot tea that smelled faintly of pine and something sweeter he couldn't name. He sipped it slowly, letting it thaw the edges of the cold that had been inside him for longer than he wanted to admit. Later, as the fire crackled low, the leader placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Tomorrow," he said, "you will learn our ways. If you wish to stay, you will have a place. If you wish to go, we will guide you." The boy stared at him. Stay. The word held a dangerous kind of hope. He had no family to return to, no house waiting for him in town. But to belong here, among people he didn't yet understand, could that be real? The hawk carving in his pocket pressed lightly against his leg. He touched it through the fabric, feeling the smooth curve of its wings. Maybe it was too soon to decide. But for the first time in years, he thought, maybe he didn't have to decide alone. The leader rose and left the lodge, leaving the boy with the silver-haired woman and the baby. The child stirred in her sleep, making a soft sound that made the boy's chest ache in a way he couldn't explain. That night, wrapped in a fur-lined blanket and lying near the warmth of the fire, the boy closed his eyes and listened to the quiet murmur of voices outside, the soft shift of snow as the wind moved it, the breathing of people sleeping nearby. And for the first time in a long, long while, he drifted into sleep without fear.